Clara May Bennett had hands that never shook, even when carrying a tray loaded with 8 steaming plates through a crowded saloon filled with rowdy cowboys who'd been drinking since noon. Those hands had been steady since she was 12 years old, the day she'd stopped speaking and started listening to the world in a way most people never bothered to do. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Dusty Boot Saloon sat at the crossroads of 3 cattle trails in Copper Ridge, Arizona, a town that existed purely because men needed somewhere to drink, eat, and spend their pay after months on the range. The building itself was nothing special: weathered pine boards, a tin roof that drummed like thunder when it rained, and windows so dusty they barely let in the desert sun. But inside, it pulsed with the kind of life that drew people from hundreds of miles around. Every evening, at exactly 5:30, Clara would emerge from the kitchen carrying the first round of dinner plates. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple braid that hung down her back like a rope, and she wore the same style of brown dress every day, practical, sturdy, with an apron tied around her waist that had seen more spilled beans and splashed whiskey than most people saw in a lifetime. She moved through the crowded room like water flowing around stones, never bumping into a chair, never disturbing a card game, never interrupting a conversation. The Cowboys knew her routine by heart. Old Jake Morrison would always be sitting at the corner table by the window, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He'd watch Clara serve every other table first, saving his meal for last, not because she was being rude, but because he understood something the younger men didn't. Clara had her own way of taking care of people, and it involved knowing exactly what each person needed before they knew it themselves. Jake had been coming to the Dusty Boot for 7 years, ever since Clara first started working there. He'd watched her grow from a thin, frightened girl who jumped at loud noises into a young woman who could handle a room full of drunk cowboys without breaking a sweat. He'd never heard her speak, not once, but he'd seen her communicate in dozens of other ways. The way she'd bring an extra biscuit to someone who looked particularly hungry. How she'd refill a coffee cup just as a man reached for it, knowing without looking that he was ready for more. The gentle way she'd touch the shoulder of a cowboy who'd had too much to drink, guiding him toward the door before he could cause trouble. Samuel Crawford owned the Dusty Boot, and he'd hired Clara when she was just a slip of a thing, all knees and elbows and eyes too big for her face. Her Aunt Martha had brought her to town after the incident that had stolen Clara's voice, looking for work and a place to start over. Samuel had needed help in the kitchen, and something about the quiet girl had appealed to him. Maybe it was the way she looked at everything with such careful attention, as if she was trying to memorize every detail of the world around her. The arrangement had worked better than anyone expected. Clara learned the kitchen like it was sheet music, knowing exactly when to start the beans so they'd be ready when the evening crowd arrived, understanding instinctively how much cornbread to bake based on the weather and the day of the week. Cowboys ate more on Saturdays, less when it was raining, and almost nothing when the temperature climbed above 90 degrees. Clara knew all of this without anyone teaching her, the same way she knew that Big Jim Palmer liked his coffee black, but his eggs over easy, and that young Bobby Fletcher would always order the stew, but only eat half of it unless she brought him extra bread to soak up the broth. The kitchen was Clara's domain, shared only with Rosie Mae Washington, a woman in her 50s who'd been cooking for cowboys and miners for more than half her life. Rosie Mae had taken one look at the silent girl and decided she needed protecting. She'd taught Clara everything about running a kitchen, how to keep the fire at just the right temperature, how to stretch ingredients when unexpected crowds showed up, how to make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, but smooth enough that it wouldn't burn a man's throat on the way down. Rosie Mae was the only person in Copper Ridge Who knew the full story of what had happened to Clara before she came to town? The others had heard pieces. Something about a fire, a family lost, a little girl who'd screamed until her voice gave out and then never spoke again. But Rosie May knew the details that mattered, the ones that explained why Clara would sometimes freeze when someone dropped a pan too loudly, or why she always made sure to keep the back door of the kitchen propped open, even in winter. The fire had taken everything. Clara's parents, her 2 younger brothers, and the little house on the outskirts of Phoenix, where she'd spent the first 12 years of her life, singing lullabies to her brothers and helping her mother with the washing. She'd been in the barn feeding the chickens when it started, and by the time she'd seen the smoke and ran toward the house, the flames were already too high. She'd screamed for her family until her throat was raw and her voice was gone, but no one had answered. No one had come out. The doctors in Phoenix had said her voice would come back eventually. Shock, they'd called it. Trauma. Her vocal cords were fine, they assured her Aunt Martha. The girl just needed time to heal, time to find her way back to speaking. But months had passed, then years, and Clara's voice had remained locked away, somewhere so deep inside her that even she couldn't find the key. Martha Crawford was Samuel's sister, a woman who'd never married, but had strong opinions about how children should be raised. She'd taken Clara in without hesitation, but she'd also made it clear that the girl would need to earn her keep. The world was hard on people who couldn't speak up for themselves, Martha said, so Clara would need to find other ways to make herself useful. Working at the Dusty Boot had been Martha's idea, a way to teach Clara how to survive in a world that didn't have much patience for quiet people. But the saloon had become more than just a place to work. It had become Clara's family, her community, her entire world. The Cowboys who came through treated her with a respect that surprised even Samuel. There was something about her silence that made men behave better, as if they understood instinctively that she'd already heard enough harsh words to last a lifetime. They watched their language around her, tipped their hats when she brought their food, and never tried to grab her hand or make inappropriate comments the way they did with some of the other girls who worked in saloons throughout the territory. Even the roughest men seemed to soften around Clara. Buck Henderson was a cattle driver known for his quick temper and quicker fists, but when Clara served his table, he'd fold his hands in his lap and wait patiently for his food like a schoolboy waiting for his teacher's approval. Red Jamison had a reputation for starting fights over card games, but when Clara was in the room, he'd settle disputes with words instead of punches, as if her presence reminded him that violence wasn't always the answer to disagreement. The regular customers had developed their own ways of communicating with Clara. They'd point to items on the menu board that Samuel had painted on the wall, or hold up fingers to indicate how many cups of coffee they wanted. Some of the more creative ones had learned a few basic hand signs that Martha had taught Clara when she first came to town. But most of the time, words weren't necessary. Clara had become so good at reading people that she could tell what they wanted just by looking at their faces. She knew that when Dave Sullivan walked in after a long drive, he'd want the biggest steak Samuel could cut, cooked just until the pink was gone but not a second longer. She could tell by the way a man sat down whether he wanted company or solitude, whether he needed strong coffee to sober up or a gentle meal to settle his stomach. She understood the difference between the rowdy laughter of men celebrating and the hollow laughter of men trying to forget something painful. The Dusty Boot's evening routine was as predictable as the desert sunset. Around 4 o'clock, Clara would start carrying plates out to the early diners, usually the older cowboys who ate supper early and were in bed before the real drinking started. By 6, the place would be full of men fresh off the trail, hungry and thirsty and ready to spend their pay. The noise level would rise steadily as the whiskey flowed, but it was a good kind of noise. The sound of men relaxing after hard work. Clara had learned to move through this chaos like a dancer, balancing plates on her arms, refilling glasses, clearing tables, all without ever saying a word. She'd developed a system of nods and gestures that worked better than most conversations. A slight tilt of her head meant coming right up. A gentle touch on a man's shoulder meant time to slow down on the drinking. A pointed look at the door meant you're getting too loud and need to take it outside. The Cowboys respected her signals because they'd learned to trust her judgment. Clara never tried to cut anyone off too early, never embarrassed a man in front of his friends, never made anyone feel unwelcome unless they were genuinely causing trouble. She had an instinct for knowing when harmless fun was about to turn into something dangerous, and she'd learned dozens of ways to redirect energy before fights could start. Samuel often said that Clara was worth 3 regular saloon girls because she prevented more trouble than she served food. Men who might have spent their evening arguing over cards would instead find themselves in quiet conversations about their families back home. Cowboys who'd been spoiling for a fight would mysteriously decide they were too tired for trouble. The Dusty Boot had a reputation as a peaceful place, and most of that reputation was due to the quiet girl, who moved through the room like a calming spirit. But Clara's silence came with a cost that most people didn't see. At night, after the last customer had stumbled out into the desert darkness and the dishes were washed and put away, Clara would lie in her small room above the saloon and listen to the sounds of the world outside her window. She'd hear coyotes calling to each other across the desert, their voices carrying for miles in the clear air. She'd listen to the night birds singing their complex songs, and to the wind whistling through the gaps in the building's wooden walls. Sometimes she'd catch herself moving her lips, trying to form words that never came. She'd remember songs her mother used to sing, lullabies she'd hummed to her little brothers, conversations she'd had with friends back in Phoenix. The memories of her voice were still there, locked away but not forgotten. She could remember exactly how it felt to laugh, to call out to someone across a room, to sing along with the church choir on Sunday mornings that Martha would sometimes find Clara standing at her window, looking out at the stars with an expression of such longing that it broke the older woman's heart. Martha had tried everything she could think of to help Clara find her voice again. She'd brought in doctors from Tucson, preachers who claimed to have healing powers, even a woman who said she could help people overcome trauma through hypnosis. Nothing had worked. Clara remained as silent as the desert at dawn. The truth that no one talked about was that Clara had become comfortable with her silence. It was safe, predictable, and it protected her from having to explain things she wasn't ready to discuss. When you didn't talk, people couldn't ask questions about your past. They couldn't make you relive memories that still felt too sharp to touch. Silence had become Clara's shield against a world that had already hurt her more than any child should be hurt. But shields, even necessary ones, came with a price. Clara had become an observer of life rather than a full participant. She watched other people form friendships, fall in love, argue and make up, celebrate and mourn together. She was part of their community, but also separate from it. Connected but isolated. Needed but never truly known. The Cowboys who frequented the Dusty Boot had created their own mythology around Clara. Some said she was the daughter of an Apache chief who'd been raised by white settlers. Others claimed she'd been born mute, but had special powers that let her know things about people that they didn't know about themselves. A few of the more romantic ones whispered that she'd been cursed by a broken heart and would only speak again when true love found her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Clara had heard all these stories, and while she found some of them amusing, she also understood that they served a purpose. People needed explanations for things they didn't understand, and her silence was something that puzzled everyone who met her. The stories they told about her were really stories they told about themselves. Ways of making sense of a world that contained mysteries they couldn't solve. The real mystery wasn't why Clara didn't speak. The real mystery was what would happen if she ever found her voice again. After 7 years of silence, would the words still be there? Would they come out the same way they had when she was 12? Or would they be different, changed by years of careful listening and quiet observation? And if she did speak, what would she say first? These were questions that even Clara couldn't answer, because she'd stopped believing that her voice would ever return. She'd accepted her silence as permanent, the way other people accepted scars or broken bones that never quite healed right. It was part of who she was now, as much a part of her identity as her dark hair or her steady hands. But sometimes, late at night when the saloon was quiet and the desert wind was singing through the eaves, Clara would feel something stirring deep in her chest. Not words exactly, but something that might become words if she was brave enough to let it out. It felt like music waiting to be born, like a song that had been growing stronger with every passing year, just waiting for the right moment to break free. She didn't know it yet, but that moment was coming sooner than she could imagine. The first sign that everything was about to change came on a Tuesday morning when the stagecoach arrived 3 hours early, covered in dust and running hard like something was chasing it. Clara was in the kitchen preparing vegetables for the evening stew when she heard the unusual commotion. Outside, horses snorting, harnesses jingling, and voices she didn't recognize speaking in urgent, clipped tones dot through the kitchen window. She watched 3 passengers climb down from the coach. The first was a woman in her 40s wearing a traveling dress that had once been fine but now showed the wear of long miles and difficult roads. Her auburn hair was pinned up despite the desert heat, and she carried herself with the kind of authority that came from making important decisions under pressure. Even covered in trail dust, there was something unmistakably professional about her bearing. The second passenger was younger, maybe 25, with ink-stained fingers and a leather satchel slung across his shoulder that bulged with papers and notebooks. He moved with the nervous energy of someone who saw stories everywhere and was always afraid of missing the most important details. His clothes marked him as an Easterner, too heavy for the desert, too formal for a frontier town like Copper Ridge. The third person to emerge from the stagecoach made Clara step back from the window in surprise. It was a girl, probably no more than 16, wearing men's clothes that had been hastily altered to fit her smaller frame. Her blonde hair was chopped short and practical, and she carried a guitar case like it was the most precious thing she owned. But it was her face that caught Clara's attention. There was something familiar about the set of her jaw, the way she looked around at her new surroundings with a mixture of hope and determination. The woman approached Samuel, who had come out to greet the unexpected arrivals. Clara couldn't hear their conversation through the window, but she could see Samuel's expression change from polite curiosity to surprise, then to something that looked almost like recognition. He nodded several times, gestured toward the saloon, and then looked directly at the kitchen window where Clara was watching. Within minutes, Samuel was pushing through the kitchen doors with an expression Clara had never seen before: excitement, mixed with nervousness, like a man who'd just been presented with an opportunity he wasn't sure he deserved. "Clara," he said, then stopped, remembering as he always did that she wouldn't answer. He pulled out the small slate board they used for communication and wrote quickly, "Important visitors. Need to discuss something with you. Can you come to the main room?" Clara wiped her hands on her apron and followed Samuel out to where the 3 strangers were seated at the best table in the house. Rosie May had already brought them coffee and was hovering nearby, clearly as curious as Clara about these unexpected guests. The woman stood when Clara approached, extending her hand in a gesture that was formal but genuinely warm. "Miss Bennett, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Morrison from the Arizona Territory Medical College in Tucson. This is Thomas Wright, a journalist from the Philadelphia Herald, and this is my assistant, Jenny Walsh." Clara shook the offered hand, noting that Dr. Morrison's grip was firm and confident. The woman continued speaking, her voice carrying the kind of educated accent that Clara remembered from her childhood, before the fire had changed everything. "I've traveled here specifically to meet you, Miss Bennett. I've been researching cases of traumatic mutism throughout the Southwest, and your situation has come to my attention through some very interesting channels." Clara felt her stomach tighten. She glanced at Samuel, who was watching the exchange with an expression she couldn't read. How did these people know about her? What did they want? And why did the young girl with the guitar keep staring at her with such intensity? Thomas Wright opened his satchel and pulled out a notebook, but Dr. Morrison held up a hand to stop him. "Before we go any further, I want you to know that we're not here to exploit your story or turn you into some kind of curiosity. What I'm going to tell you might be difficult to hear, but I believe it could also offer you something you may have thought was lost forever." The doctor reached into her own bag and withdrew a folder filled with official-looking documents. 6 months ago, I received a letter from a colleague in Phoenix. He'd been going through old medical records from the Territorial Hospital, cases that had been archived and largely forgotten. He found your file from 7 years ago, after the fire that took your family. Clara's hands began to tremble. She hadn't thought about those doctors in years, the ones who had poked and prodded and finally declared that her voice would return when she was ready. The ones who had been wrong. "The doctor who treated you made extensive notes about your condition," Dr. Morrison continued. "But more importantly, he made notes about your family's medical history. Information that I don't think anyone ever shared with you or your aunt." Samuel moved closer to Clara, sensing her distress. "What kind of information?" he asked when Clara remained silent. Dr. Morrison opened the folder and pulled out a sheet of paper covered in medical terminology. "Your mother, Miss Bennett, was treated for a condition called selective mutism when she was a child. It's a condition where people have the physical ability to speak, but cannot do so in certain situations due to extreme anxiety or trauma. The interesting thing about this condition is that it often has a hereditary component." Clara stared at the paper, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. Her mother had never mentioned being unable to speak as a child. But then again, there were many things about her mother's past that had never been discussed in their household. "What Dr. Morrison is suggesting," Thomas Wright interjected, his pencil poised over his notebook, "is that your silence might not be permanent damage from trauma, but rather a treatable condition that runs in your family." Jenny Walsh, the girl with the guitar, finally spoke up. Her voice was soft but carried clearly across the room. "My sister had the same thing. She didn't speak for 3 years after our parents died in a mining accident up in Colorado. Everyone said she'd never talk again." "And did she?" Samuel asked, voicing the question that Clara couldn't. Jenny smiled, and her whole face transformed. "She did. Dr. Morrison helped her find her voice again. That's why I'm here. My sister sent me to help with your case because she thought I might understand what you're going through." Dr. Morrison nodded approvingly at her young assistant. "Jenny has been working with me for the past year, helping other patients who've lost their voices to trauma. She has a unique gift for connecting with people who've chosen silence as a form of protection." Clara looked around the table at these 3 strangers who claimed to understand her better than she understood herself. Part of her wanted to run back to the kitchen, to the safety of her routine and her silence. But another part of her, a part that had been dormant for 7 years, was stirring with something that felt dangerously close to hope. "The treatment isn't easy," Dr. Morrison continued, as if reading Clara's thoughts. "It requires confronting the memories and emotions that led to the silence in the first place. But I've had remarkable success with patients who've been mute for even longer than you have." Thomas Wright leaned forward, his journalist's instincts clearly engaged. "Dr. Morrison has helped over 30 people regain their voices in the past 5 years. Her methods are revolutionary, combining medical treatment with what she calls graduated exposure therapy." "What does that mean exactly?" Samuel asked, his protective instincts clearly aroused by all this talk of treatment and confronting memories. Dr. Morrison turned to Jenny, who opened her guitar case and pulled out a beautiful instrument with intricate silver inlays around the sound hole. "It means we start small. Sometimes the voice comes back through music before it comes back through words. Jenny here is not just my assistant. She's also a trained music therapist." Jenny strummed a few soft chords, and the sound filled the saloon in a way that made everyone present seem to relax slightly. Even Clara felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as the gentle melody washed over her. Music reaches parts of the brain that regular speech therapy can't touch, Jenny explained, her fingers continuing to move across the strings. "It can unlock memories and emotions that have been buried under trauma. Sometimes a person can hum a melody even when they can't speak a single word." Clara's chest tightened as she listened to the guitar. There was something hauntingly familiar about the melody Jenny was playing, something that reminded her of evenings on the porch of her childhood home, her mother singing lullabies while Clara's father played his old fiddle and her little brothers danced around the yard, catching fireflies. Dr. Morrison was watching Clara's face carefully. "You recognize that song, don't you?" Clara nodded before she could stop herself. It was Red River Valley, a tune her family had loved, one of the last songs she remembered hearing before the fire changed everything. "Your Aunt Martha mentioned in her letter that you used to sing before the accident," Dr. Morrison said gently. "She said you had a beautiful voice, that you used to sing your brothers to sleep every night." The mention of her brothers hit Clara like a physical blow. She stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair, and headed for the kitchen. But instead of following her usual retreat pattern, she stopped at the doorway and turned back to face the table. For the first time in 7 years, Clara opened her mouth with the intention of making a sound. Not words, not even a whisper, but something. What came out was barely audible, more breath than voice, but it was unmistakably an attempt at the melody Jenny was playing. The saloon went completely silent. Even the usual sounds from the street outside seemed to fade away as everyone present realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Clara's hand flew to her throat in surprise at the sound she'd just made, and her eyes filled with tears. Jenny continued playing, her fingers gentle on the strings, encouraging without pushing. Dr. Morrison remained perfectly still, as if any sudden movement might break the spell. Thomas Wright had forgotten all about his notebook and was simply staring in amazement. Samuel was the first to move. He walked slowly to where Clara stood frozen in the doorway and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That was beautiful, Clara," he said softly. "Just like your aunt always said it would be." The moment stretched out like a held breath, and then Clara bolted for the kitchen, letting the doors swing shut behind her. But this time, her retreat felt different. It wasn't the panicked flight of someone trying to escape. It was the strategic withdrawal of someone who needed time to process something life-changing. In the kitchen, Rosie May was waiting with a cup of hot tea and the kind of understanding expression that came from raising 6 children of her own. She didn't ask questions or try to make Clara talk about what had just happened. She simply handed over the tea and went back to her cooking, humming softly under her breath. Meanwhile, in the main room, Dr. Morrison was explaining to Samuel and the others what they had just witnessed. That was a breakthrough, small but significant. Clara's voice is still there, just locked away behind layers of protective silence. What we heard was her unconscious mind responding to familiar music before her conscious mind could stop it. Thomas Wright was scribbling frantically in his notebook now. "How long would treatment take? If she agreed to it, I mean." "That depends on Clara," Dr. Morrison replied. "Some patients respond quickly once the initial breakthrough happens. Others need months of careful work. But what I can tell you is that she's already taken the hardest step. She's made a sound with the intention of making music." That's further than many of my patients get in their first month of treatment. Jenny packed away her guitar with the careful attention of someone who understood the power of the instrument she carried. The next step would be to see if she can repeat what just happened. Sometimes the first breakthrough is also the last one if the patient gets scared and shuts down completely. Samuel looked toward the kitchen doors, behind which Clara was presumably trying to make sense of what had just occurred. She's been through so much. I don't want to push her into something she's not ready for. And we wouldn't want that either, Dr. Morrison assured him. The decision has to be entirely hers. What I can offer is hope and a treatment plan that has worked for dozens of other people in similar situations. But Clara has to want her voice back badly enough to do the difficult work of reclaiming it. The conversation continued for another hour, with Dr. Morrison explaining her methods and Thomas Wright asking detailed questions about the success rates of her treatments. Jenny mostly listened, occasionally adding insights about her own sisters, recovery, or observations about Clara's reaction to the music. Finally, Dr. Morrison stood and gathered her papers. We'll be staying at the boarding house for the next few days. I don't expect an immediate answer, but I hope Clara will consider what we've discussed. Sometimes the hardest part of healing is believing that healing is possible. As the three visitors prepared to leave, Jenny approached Samuel with a small piece of paper. This is the name of the song I was playing, along with the chords. If Clara would like to hear it again, or if she wants to try humming along when no one else is around, having the music available might help. After they left, Samuel sat alone in the empty saloon, looking at the piece of paper Jenny had given him. The song was indeed Red River Valley, written out in simple notation with guitar chords marked above the melody line. At the bottom, Jenny had written a note: "Music is the language the heart speaks when words aren't enough." From the kitchen came the soft sounds of Clara helping Rosie May prepare for the evening crowd. But now those sounds seemed different to Samuel, charged with new possibility. For the first time in 7 years, the silence in his saloon felt like something that might be temporary rather than permanent. The question now was whether Clara would be brave enough to believe in the possibility of change, or whether the fear of disappointment would keep her locked in the safety of her silence forever. Samuel folded the piece of paper carefully and slipped it into his vest pocket, wondering if he'd just witnessed the beginning of a miracle or simply a cruel tease of what could never be. 3 sleepless nights followed Dr. Morrison's visit, each one stretching longer than the last as Clara lay in her narrow bed above the saloon, staring at the ceiling and replaying that single moment when sound had escaped her lips. The memory felt both precious and terrifying, like holding a butterfly that might fly away if she gripped too tightly or die if she let it go. During the day, Clara threw herself into her work with an intensity that worried both Samuel and Rosie May. She scrubbed floors that were already clean, reorganized storage rooms that didn't need organizing, and prepared enough food to feed twice their usual crowd. Her hands, always steady, now moved with an almost frantic energy, as if constant motion could quiet the storm raging inside her head. The regular customers noticed the change immediately. Big Tom Murphy, a cattle driver who'd been coming to the Dusty Boot for 4 years, mentioned to Samuel that Clara seemed wound tighter than a $2 watch. Jake Morrison, who understood Clara better than most, began lingering after his meals, watching her with the concerned eyes of someone who recognized the signs of internal battle. It was Jake who first noticed Clara humming. She was wiping down tables after the lunch crowd had cleared out, moving through her routine with mechanical precision, when the faintest melody began to drift from her throat. It was so quiet that Jake wasn't even sure he'd heard it at first. But as he sat perfectly still, pretending to read his week-old newspaper, the sound came again, a few bars of Red River Valley, barely audible above the creak of the building settling in the afternoon heat. Clara seemed unaware she was making any sound at all. Her lips weren't moving, and her expression remained focused on her work. But the melody continued in soft, broken phrases, as if some part of her was practicing without permission from her conscious mind. Jake folded his newspaper carefully and approached the bar where Samuel was counting the day's receipts. "Sam," he said quietly, "you might want to listen to what's happening over there." Samuel looked up from his money, followed Jake's gaze to where Clara was still working, and froze. The humming was clearer now, more confident, though still barely above a whisper. It was the most beautiful sound Samuel had ever heard in his saloon, not because of its volume or perfection, but because of what it represented. The two men stood motionless, afraid that any acknowledgement might break the spell. Clara continued her work, the melody weaving in and out of her breathing like a natural part of her rhythm. For nearly 10 minutes, the soft humming filled the space between the tables, transforming the ordinary afternoon into something magical. Then Clara reached for a glass that wasn't there, her hand closing on empty air, and the sudden break in her routine shattered her unconscious state. The humming stopped abruptly as she realized what she'd been doing. Her face flushed deep red, and she hurried toward the kitchen without looking at either Samuel or Jake. "Don't you dare follow her," Jake warned Samuel, who had taken a step toward the kitchen doors. "She needs to process this on her own terms." In the kitchen, Clara found Rosie May peeling potatoes for the evening stew, humming her own tune, a spiritual she'd learned from her grandmother back in Louisiana. Rosie May looked up when Clara entered, noted the younger woman's flushed cheeks and trembling hands, and simply nodded toward the pile of carrots waiting to be chopped. "Sometimes," Rosie May said, continuing her work without looking directly at Clara, "the heart knows things the head ain't ready to accept. No shame in that, child. Heart's been around a lot longer than all our fancy thinking." Clara picked up a knife and began chopping carrots with more force than necessary. The repetitive motion helped calm her racing pulse, but it couldn't quiet the questions swirling in her mind. If she could hum without thinking about it, did that mean her voice was really still there? And if it was, what did that mean for the life she'd built around its absence? The truth was, Clara had become comfortable with being the silent girl of Copper Ridge. Her identity was wrapped up in her muteness, and the idea of changing that felt like losing herself entirely. People knew what to expect from her: reliability, competence, quiet understanding. If she started speaking again, would she still be the same person? Would the Cowboys still treat her with the same respectful affection? Would Samuel still need her in the same way? More frightening still was the possibility of failure. What if she tried Dr. Morrison's treatment and discovered that the humming was as far as her voice would ever return? What if she raised everyone's hopes, including her own, only to find that 7 years of silence had damaged something that couldn't be repaired? The disappointment might be worse than never trying at all. That evening, as Clara served the dinner crowd, she found herself listening to the conversations around her with new attention. She'd always been a careful observer, but now she was studying the mechanics of communication itself. How did people choose their words? How did they know when to speak and when to listen? How did they handle the vulnerability of putting their thoughts into sounds that others might judge or misunderstand? At the corner table, 3 young cowboys were arguing about the best route to drive cattle from Texas to Kansas. Their voices rose and fell with passion, each man convinced his opinion was the only correct one. Clara watched as they interrupted each other, gestured wildly with their hands, and finally erupted into laughter when they realized they were all describing variations of the same trail dot at another table. An older man was telling a story about a horse he'd once owned, his voice growing softer and more reverent as he described the animal's intelligence and loyalty. His companions listened with respectful attention, understanding that this wasn't just a story about a horse, but about a friendship that had meant everything to the storyteller. Near the bar, 2 card players were conducting an entire conversation. In murmurs and meaningful looks, communicating volumes about their hands without ever speaking directly about the game. Clara realized that even people who could speak often chose not to, using silence as a tool just as deliberately as she used it as a shield. Dr. Morrison returned to the saloon the next afternoon, this time accompanied only by Jenny Walsh. The young music therapist carried her guitar case in a small canvas bag that clinked softly with what sounded like other instruments. "We don't want to pressure you," Dr. Morrison said after Samuel had brought them coffee, "but we wondered if you'd be willing to listen to what Jenny has to say about her sister's recovery." Clara nodded, though her heart was racing. She seated herself across from the two women, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. Jenny opened her guitar case, but didn't remove the instrument. Instead, she leaned forward and spoke in the same gentle voice Clara remembered from their first meeting. "My sister Emma was 15 when our parents died. She was in the mine office when the explosion happened, and she saw—" Jenny paused, her own voice catching slightly. "She saw things no one should have to see. When they pulled the survivors out, Emma was found sitting in a corner, completely silent. She didn't speak for 3 years." Clara felt a chill of recognition. The details were different, but the core experience, witnessing unspeakable loss, the retreat into protective silence, was achingly familiar. "Everyone told us Emma would never speak again," Jenny continued. "The doctors, the preacher, even our own grandmother. They said her mind had broken from the shock, that we should be grateful she was alive and stop hoping for more." Dr. Morrison picked up the story. "I met Emma at a territorial hospital where she was being treated for what they called chronic melancholia. The other doctors had given up on her, but I saw something in her eyes that told me her silence was a choice, not a disability." "What convinced you to try treatment?" Samuel asked, speaking for Clara, who remained focused on every word. Jenny smiled, and Clara saw in that expression the same mixture of pain and hope that she felt in her own chest. "It was music that reached her. First, just like with you yesterday. I was visiting Emma at the hospital, trying to think of ways to connect with her, when I started playing an old song our mother used to sing. Emma began to cry, the first emotion she'd shown in months. And then, so quietly I almost missed it. She started humming along." Clara's breath caught. The parallel was unmistakable. "The humming led to simple vocalizations," Dr. Morrison explained. "We worked for months on breathing exercises, gradually building up Emma's confidence in making sounds. It wasn't a straight line. Some days she'd make progress, others she'd retreat completely. But eventually, she began to trust that her voice wouldn't betray her." "Where is Emma now?" Samuel asked. Jenny's smile brightened. "She's married to a rancher up in Colorado, with 2 children of her own. She teaches Sunday school at their local church, and according to her letters, she talks so much that her husband sometimes begs for a few minutes of quiet." The image of someone recovering so completely from such profound silence filled Clara with an emotion she couldn't name. It was hope mixed with fear, longing mixed with skepticism, desire mixed with terror. Dr. Morrison reached into her medical bag and withdrew a small leather journal. "I'd like to show you something, Clara. This is Emma's treatment diary, notes. She wrote to me when she still couldn't speak out loud. She wanted me to share it with other patients who might be facing the same decision she faced." She opened the journal to a page covered in careful handwriting and placed it where Clara could read it. Day 47. "Dr. Morrison asked me today what I'm most afraid of if I start talking again. I told her, in writing, that I'm afraid people will expect me to be the same person I was before. But I'm not that person anymore. The girl who died in the mine explosion died too, in a way. If I speak again, who will I be? What if the new me isn't someone people can love?" Clara's eyes filled with tears as she read words that could have come from her own heart. The fear of change, the terror of vulnerability, the uncertainty about identity. Emma had felt it all. Dr. Morrison turned to another page. Day 63. I hummed today during my session with Jenny, and for a moment I remembered what it felt like to make music with my family. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. I realized that staying silent doesn't protect me from pain. It just keeps me from experiencing joy too. Another page. Day 89. I said my first word today. Hello. It came out as a whisper, but Jenny heard it and cried. I cried too. Not because I was sad, but because I remembered that my voice belongs to me. The accident took my parents and my childhood, but it doesn't get to take my voice too. That's mine to give or keep. Clara read several more entries, each one documenting Emma's gradual journey from silence to speech. But more than the technical progress, the diary revealed the emotional courage required to reclaim something that had been buried under trauma and fear. Jenny had been watching Clara's face as she read. Emma wanted me to tell you something specific. She said that finding her voice again didn't erase what happened to our family, and it didn't make her the same person she was before. But it did give her the tools to build a new life, one where she could choose when to speak and when to be quiet, instead of having silence chosen for her. Dr. Morrison closed the journal and placed it on the table between them. I'm not going to pressure you for a decision today, Clara. This is too important to rush. But I want you to know that if you choose to try, you won't be alone. Jenny and I have walked this path with other people, and we know how difficult and rewarding it can be. Clara stared at the closed journal, thinking about Emma's words. The idea that someone could recover so completely from such profound loss was almost too much to believe. But the evidence was there in black and white, proof that silence didn't have to be permanent, that voices could be reclaimed even after years of absence. Take your time, Jenny said, packing away the journal. But remember that time doesn't heal everything by itself. Sometimes we have to actively choose healing, even when it's scary. After the two women left, Clara remained at the table, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. For 7 years, she'd told herself that accepting her silence was a form of strength. But what if the real strength lay in risking that silence for the possibility of something more? The sun was setting over Copper Ridge, painting the saloon in shades of gold and amber. In a few hours, the evening crowd would arrive, and Clara would move through her familiar routine of serving meals and observing conversations she couldn't join. But for the first time in years, that routine felt less like safety and more like a prison of her own making. As she sat alone in the quiet saloon, Clara began to hum again, not the unconscious melody of the day before, but a deliberate, conscious choice to make sound. It was still Red River Valley, but this time she was fully aware of each note, each breath, each moment when her voice carried beyond the boundaries of her silence. The humming grew slightly stronger as Clara's confidence built. She thought about Emma's words, that staying silent didn't protect from pain, it only prevented joy. She thought about her mother, who had apparently overcome her own struggles with silence to build a family filled with music and laughter. She thought about the possibility of calling out to Samuel from across the room, of joining the Cowboys' conversations, of singing lullabies to children she might someday have. But she also thought about the risks, the vulnerability of speech, the possibility of failure, the terrifying prospect of changing everything she'd built her identity around. The humming wavered as these fears crowded in, but it didn't stop completely when Rosie May emerged from the kitchen to begin preparing. For the evening crowd, she found Clara still sitting at the table, still humming softly, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, gathering courage to jump into an unknown future that might destroy her or might finally allow her to fly. The decision came to Clara at dawn on a Thursday, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual recognition of something that had been building in her chest for days. She stood at her window watching the sun paint the desert mountains pink and gold, and realized that the fear of staying silent forever had finally grown larger than the fear of trying to speak again. She found Samuel in the main room, sweeping floors and preparing for another day of serving cowboys and travelers. When he looked up and saw her expression, he immediately set aside his broom and gave her his full attention. Clara pulled out the small writing pad she'd been carrying since Dr. Morrison's visit and wrote carefully, "I want to try, but I need to do this my way, on my own terms." Samuel read the note twice, then looked up at Clara with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "What do you need from me?" Clara wrote again, "Send word to Dr. Morrison. Tell her I'll start the treatment, but I want to begin here in the saloon, with people I trust. If I'm going to find my voice again, it should be in the place where I learned to live without it." Samuel nodded immediately. "I'll ride to town this morning and bring them back with me. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Clara's hand trembled slightly as she wrote her response. "I'm not ready, but I'm tired of being afraid." Dr. Morrison arrived that afternoon with Jenny, Walsh, and a collection of equipment that transformed the saloon's back room into an impromptu therapy space. But unlike the sterile medical environments Clara remembered from her childhood, this space felt safe and familiar, surrounded by the comforting sounds and smells of the place she'd called home for 7 years. "The first thing we need to establish," Dr. Morrison explained, arranging her instruments on a makeshift table, "is that your vocal cords are physically capable of producing speech. From what I observed during your humming episodes, I'm confident they are, but I'd like to do a proper examination." Clara submitted to the medical tests with the stoic patience she'd developed over years of necessary interactions with the outside world. Dr. Morrison used a small mirror to examine her throat, checked her breathing capacity, and performed several other assessments that Clara didn't fully understand but endured without complaint. "Excellent news," Dr. Morrison announced when the examination was complete. "Your vocal cords show no signs of physical damage. They're actually in remarkably good condition for someone who hasn't used them regularly in 7 years. The muscles are weakened from disuse, but that's something we can address with proper exercises." Jenny had been setting up her guitar and several other instruments Clara didn't recognize: a small drum, something that looked like a wooden flute, and a peculiar stringed instrument that resembled a guitar, but was much smaller and had an unusually sweet tone when Jenny tested it. "This is a mountain dulcimer," Jenny explained, noticing Clara's curiosity. "It's tuned to make harmony almost impossible to avoid. Even if you only hum along, you'll be making music that sounds beautiful. Sometimes people find their voices more easily when they're not worried about hitting the wrong notes." The first exercise was deceptively simple. Dr. Morrison had Clara lie on a blanket on the floor, one hand on her chest and one on her stomach, and asked her to breathe so that only the lower hand moved. Clara had done similar exercises years ago during her initial medical treatment, but this time felt different. This time, she was choosing to participate rather than simply enduring another doctor's examination. "Most people breathe from their chest," Dr. Morrison explained as Clara practiced the technique, "but singers and speakers breathe from their diaphragm. After 7 years of quiet, shallow breathing, we need to retrain your body to take the kind of deep breaths that support vocal production." The breathing exercises continued for nearly an hour, with Jenny providing soft musical accompaniment. That helped Clara maintain a steady rhythm. Gradually, Clara began to feel a difference in how the air moved through her body, a sense of fullness and support she hadn't experienced since childhood. "Now," Dr. Morrison said, "I want you to add a very gentle sound to your exhale. Not loud, not forced, just a whisper of voice riding on the breath." Clara's first attempts produced nothing but air, but she persisted, encouraged by the patient expressions on both women's faces. On her 7th try, a tiny vocalization emerged, barely audible, but unmistakably intentional. Jenny smiled and played a soft chord that matched the pitch of Clara's vocalization. That's it. That's your voice saying hello after a long sleep. Over. The next 2 hours, Clara gradually built from whispered ahs to slightly stronger oohs and ees. Each sound felt strange and foreign, as if someone else were making them, but also oddly familiar, like remembering a skill she'd thought was lost forever. The hardest part wasn't the physical act of making sound. It was overcoming the mental barrier that had convinced her for 7 years that her voice was gone. Every time Clara opened her mouth with the intention of vocalizing, a part of her brain screamed warnings about disappointment, failure, and the vulnerability of being heard. It's perfectly normal to feel resistance, Dr. Morrison observed during a break when Clara was struggling with particularly stubborn silence. Your mind has built powerful protective mechanisms around your voice. We're asking it to lower those defenses, which feels dangerous even when you intellectually know it's safe. Samuel had been quietly observing from the doorway, and Clara could see the mixture of hope and concern in his expression. This was hard for him too. She realized, watching someone he cared about struggle with something so fundamental as making sound. As the afternoon wore on, Clara's vocalizations grew slightly stronger and more consistent. She could produce simple vowel sounds on command, though they still came out as little more than breathy whispers. But progress was progress, and everyone in the room treated each small success as a victory worthy of celebration. Tomorrow, Dr. Morrison said as they prepared to end the first session, we'll work on consonants. Simple combinations like maya and baya, sounds that don't require complex tongue positions. Jenny packed away her instruments with obvious satisfaction. You did beautifully today, Clara. I know it doesn't feel like much, but you've accomplished something remarkable. You've chosen to trust your voice again. That evening, as Clara served the dinner crowd, she found herself hyper-aware of every sound in the saloon. The clink of silverware against plates, the scrape of chairs on wooden floors, the rumble of men's voices discussing cattle prices and weather patterns. It all seemed louder and more complex than she'd ever noticed before. But more than that, she was aware of her own silence in a new way. Instead of feeling like a natural state, it now felt like a choice she was actively making with every breath. She could speak if she wanted to, maybe not loudly or clearly, but she could make sounds that carried meaning. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Jake Morrison was at his usual corner table, and when Clara brought his dinner, he looked up at her with a question in his eyes. Word had spread through the small community that Clara was working with the doctors, and everyone was curious about what it might mean. Clara met his gaze and, very deliberately, took a deep breath the way Dr. Morrison had taught her. Then, so quietly that Jake had to lean forward to hear, she whispered, "Thank you." The words were barely audible, rough and uncertain, but they were unmistakably words. Jake's eyes widened in amazement, then filled with tears. He reached out as if to touch Clara's hand, then stopped himself, understanding that this moment was too precious and fragile for dramatic gestures. "You're welcome," he whispered back, his own voice thick with emotion. Clara felt a rush of something she hadn't experienced in 7 years. The satisfaction of direct communication, of choosing specific words to convey specific meaning to another person. It was intoxicating and exhausting at the same time. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of hyper-awareness. Clara found herself listening to conversations with new intensity, studying how people used their voices to convey not just information but emotion, personality, and intent. She noticed that some men spoke loudly to command attention, while others used quiet voices to draw people closer. She observed how laughter could fill a room with warmth, how a well-timed joke could diffuse tension, how a gentle tone could comfort someone who was struggling. When the last customer had left and the dishes were washed, Clara sat with Samuel and Rosie May at one of the tables. sharing a late meal and the comfortable silence that had characterized their evenings for years. But tonight, the silence felt different, not empty, but full of possibility. Samuel looked across the table at Clara and spoke carefully, as if testing new ground. "How do you feel about today?" Clara considered the question seriously, then reached for her writing pad. But instead of writing, she took a deep breath and whispered, "Scared, but hopeful." The words came out clearer than her earlier attempt with Jake, though still barely above a whisper. Rosie May's hand flew to her heart, and Samuel's face lit up with joy. "That's the most beautiful thing I've heard in 7 years," Samuel said. Softly. Clara tried to smile, but her emotions were too complex for simple expressions. She felt proud of the progress she'd made, but also vulnerable in a way that was almost overwhelming. Speaking, even at a whisper, felt like removing armor she'd worn for so long that she'd forgotten what it was like to be unprotected. The second day of treatment brought new challenges and small victories. Dr. Morrison introduced consonant sounds, starting with simple combinations that didn't require complex tongue movements. Ma, ba, da, sounds that felt childish and remedial, but were actually the building blocks of more complex speech. Jenny accompanied each exercise with gentle music, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a private concert than a medical procedure. Clara found that the musical framework helped her relax, reducing the anxiety that made her throat tighten and her breathing shallow. "Your voice is getting stronger," Dr. Morrison observed as Clara worked through a series of vowel and consonant combinations. "I can hear more resonance, more control. Your vocal cords are remembering their job." The breakthrough came during an exercise where Jenny was playing Amazing Grace and encouraging Clara to hum along. Clara had been following the melody successfully, when Jenny suddenly stopped playing, leaving Clara's voice exposed and alone in the silence. For a moment, Clara panicked and her humming stopped. But then, instead of retreating into silence, she made a conscious choice to continue. Her voice, still quiet and uncertain, carried the melody forward without instrumental support. "I was lost, but now am found," Clara sang, the words emerging as clearly as if she'd been speaking all her life. The room went completely still. Clara's eyes widened in shock at what she'd just done, not just vocalized, but sung actual words, a complete phrase with meaning and melody. Jenny's eyes filled with tears as she resumed playing, supporting Clara's tentative voice with gentle chords. Dr. Morrison sat motionless, hardly daring to breathe, afraid that any movement might break the spell. Clara continued singing, her voice growing slightly stronger with each line. "Was blind, but now I see." The words seemed to carry special meaning, as if she were describing her own journey from silence to sound, from isolation to connection. When the song ended, Clara sat in stunned silence, her hand pressed to her throat as if she couldn't believe the sounds had come from her own body. The simple act of singing words, of combining voice and meaning and melody, felt like discovering a superpower she'd forgotten she possessed. "Clara," Dr. Morrison said gently, "do you understand what just happened?" Clara nodded, then whispered, I actually sang." "You did more than that," Jenny added, wiping tears from her cheeks. "You chose to continue when the music stopped. You trusted your voice to carry the melody alone. That's a huge step forward." The rest of the session focused on building Clara's confidence in her newly rediscovered ability. She practiced speaking simple words, then short phrases gradually, increasing both volume and clarity. Her voice was still rough and uncertain, nothing like the clear tones she remembered from childhood. But it was unmistakably functional. By the end of the second day, Clara could whisper her name, say please and thank you, and even manage a quiet good morning that Samuel could hear from across the room. Each word felt like a small miracle, a victory over 7 years of enforced silence. That evening, as Clara prepared to serve the dinner crowd, she made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of moving through her usual routine in complete silence, she began to quietly speak to the customers as she served their meals. "Enjoy your dinner," she whispered to a table of cowboys from a ranch north of town. "More coffee?" she asked. An elderly prospector who'd been nursing the same cup for an hour. "The stew is especially good tonight," she told a young couple who were traveling through California. Her voice was so quiet that some customers had to lean forward to hear her. But the impact was electric. Word spread quickly through the saloon that Clara Bennett was speaking, and the usual dinner conversation was replaced by an atmosphere of respectful amazement. Men who had known Clara only as the silent serving girl found themselves having brief but meaningful exchanges with someone they were meeting, in a sense, for the first time. She wasn't just the quiet girl who brought their food anymore. She was a person with opinions, preferences, and the ability to express them. Jake Morrison was one of the last to be served that evening, and when Clara approached his table, he looked up with anticipation. "Good evening, Jake," Clara said, her voice still whisper quiet, but clearly audible. "Good evening, Clara," he replied, speaking as softly as she was, as if they were sharing a secret. "It's wonderful to finally hear your voice." Clara smiled a real smile, full of joy and relief and the dawning realization that she was no longer the person she'd been that morning. She was still Clara Bennett, still the girl who'd lost her family in a fire, still someone who preferred listening to talking. But she was also someone who could choose when to speak and when to be silent. Someone who could use her voice as a tool for connection rather than hiding behind its absence. The transformation had begun, and there was no going back. Progress, Clara discovered, was not a straight line. For every day that brought new words and clearer speech, there seemed to be another when her voice would retreat without warning, leaving her frustrated and questioning whether she'd made a terrible mistake in trying to reclaim something that might be lost forever. The setbacks began during her 4th day of treatment. Clara woke with a sore throat and a sense of dread that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than physical discomfort. When Dr. Morrison asked her to repeat the previous day's exercises, Clara found that her voice had disappeared almost entirely. She could barely produce the whispered vowel sounds that had come so easily just 24 hours earlier. "This is completely normal," Dr. Morrison assured her, but Clara could see concern flickering behind the doctor's professional composure. "Vocal recovery isn't linear. Your throat muscles are learning new patterns, and sometimes they need to rest and reset. We call these episodes protective regression. Your voice is pulling back to a place where it feels safe." Jenny tried to provide musical support, playing gentle melodies that had previously coaxed sound from Clara's reluctant throat, but nothing worked. Clara sat in the makeshift therapy room, opening and closing her mouth like a fish gasping for air, producing nothing but frustrated silence. The psychological impact of the setback was worse than the physical loss of sound. Clara had begun to imagine a future where she could participate in conversations, where she could call out to Samuel from across the room, where she could sing lullabies to children she might someday have. Now that future felt like a cruel fantasy, something she'd been foolish to believe was possible. By noon, Clara had retreated to her old patterns of communication, the writing pad, the meaningful looks, the elaborate pantomime that had served her for 7 years. But now these methods felt clunky and inadequate in ways they never had before. She'd tasted the freedom of direct vocal communication, and returning to silence felt like losing a limb. Samuel found her in the kitchen, sitting at the small table where she and Rosie May usually shared their meals, staring at a blank page in her writing pad as if words might magically appear there. Her face was streaked with tears she hadn't bothered to wipe away. "Talk to me," Samuel said, then immediately winced at his choice of words. "I mean, tell me what you're feeling. However you can." Clara picked up her pencil and wrote with shaking hands. "What if I can't get it back? What if yesterday was all I'll ever have?" Samuel read the note and felt his heart break for the young woman he'd watched struggle with such courage over the past few days. He sat down across from her and spoke with the gentle authority of someone who'd helped many people through difficult times. "Clara, honey, you've been silent for 7 years. Did you really think 4 days of treatment would erase all of that? Recovery takes time, and it's messy, and it doesn't happen in a straight line." Clara wrote another note. "But what if this is as far as I can go? What if the humming and those few words are all my voice will ever be?" "Then that's still more than you had a week ago," Samuel replied. "And if that's all you get back, it's still a miracle. But I don't think it is all you'll get back. I think you're scared because you're starting to hope, and hope is the scariest thing in the world when you've lived without it for so long." Dr. Morrison appeared in the kitchen doorway, having heard voices and come to investigate. She took in Clara's tear-stained face and the discarded writing pad, and immediately understood what was happening. "May I sit with you?" she asked, and when Clara nodded, she pulled up a chair. "I want to tell you about a patient I treated 2 years ago. His name was Marcus, and he'd been mute for 12 years after a traumatic brain injury. Like you, he had several good days of progress early in treatment. Then he hit a wall that lasted for 3 weeks. Clara looked up with interest, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Marcus was convinced that the setback meant he'd never speak again," Dr. Morrison continued. "He wanted to quit treatment entirely. His family was ready to give up too. But I asked him to give me 1 more week, just 7 more days. On the 6th day, his voice came back stronger than it had ever been during his initial progress." Clara reached for her pencil. "What made the difference?" "Time," Dr. Morrison said simply. "And persistence. And learning to trust the process even when it felt like nothing was working. Marcus's brain needed those 3 weeks to consolidate what he'd learned. When his voice returned, it was more stable and more natural than it had been before the setback." Jenny appeared in the kitchen carrying her guitar case and a canvas bag full of what looked like children's toys. "I brought some things that might help," she said, setting her burden on the table. "Sometimes when traditional therapy isn't working, we need to approach the voice from a different angle." She opened the bag and withdrew several items that made Clara raise her eyebrows. A wooden whistle painted bright red, a harmonica with intricate silver details, a small kalimba that made soft melodic tones when Jenny plucked its metal tines, and something that looked like a cross between a flute and a toy. "These are voice substitutes," Jenny explained. "Instruments that let you make music and express emotion even when your vocal cords aren't cooperating. Sometimes working with these tools helps people remember that communication doesn't always require perfect speech." Clara picked up the kalimba, fascinated by the gentle sounds it produced when she touched its metal prongs. The notes were pure and clear, nothing like the rough whispers she'd been struggling to produce with her voice, but they felt expressive in a way that satisfied something deep in her chest. "Play whatever feels right," Jenny encouraged, settling her guitar across her lap. "Don't think about melodies or songs. Just let your fingers find sounds that match what you're feeling." For the next hour, Clara explored the various instruments while Jenny provided gentle accompaniment. She discovered that the harmonica required breath control similar to singing, which helped her practice the breathing techniques Dr. Morrison had taught her. The whistle was satisfying in its simplicity, one clear, bright note that cut through any other sound in the room, but it was the kalimba that captured her imagination. The small wooden instrument seemed to respond to her emotions, producing melancholy tones when she was sad, brighter melodies when she felt hopeful, complex harmonies when she was confused or conflicted. It was like having a voice that didn't require her throat to work properly. "This is beautiful," Dr. Morrison observed, as Clara played an improvised melody that seemed to capture her frustration and hope in equal measure. "You're communicating as clearly with that instrument as most people do with words." Clara looked up from the kalimba with surprise. She hadn't thought of her playing as communication, but Dr. Morrison was right. The music was expressing things she couldn't put into writing, emotions too complex for simple words. That afternoon, instead of struggling with vocal exercises that weren't working, Clara spent time learning to play simple melodies on the kalimba while Jenny accompanied her. On guitar, it wasn't the speech therapy they'd planned, but it was music therapy in its purest form, using sound to process emotion and trauma in ways that words couldn't touch. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Clara was playing a melody that reminded her of something her mother used to hum while cooking dinner, a simple tune that carried memories of warmth and safety and family dinners around a wooden table. As her fingers moved across the kalimba's tines, Clara found herself thinking about her mother's voice, not the screaming from the night of the fire, but the gentle humming that had been the soundtrack of their daily life. Without conscious decision, Clara began to hum along with the kalimba. The sound was barely audible at first, more breath than voice, but it was there. Jenny heard it immediately and adjusted her guitar playing to support Clara's tentative melody. "That's it," Jenny whispered, not wanting to break Clara's concentration. "Follow the music wherever it wants to go." Clara's humming grew slightly stronger as she lost herself in the familiar melody. The kalimba provided a safety net. If her voice failed, the instrument would continue the song. But gradually, her humming became the lead voice, with the kalimba providing harmonies and the guitar supplying gentle rhythm. When the song ended, Clara sat in amazed silence, her hand pressed to her throat. She'd just sung, not words, but melody, and emotion and memory for nearly 3 minutes, without thinking about vocal exercises or breathing techniques, or the possibility of failure. "How do you feel?" Dr. Morrison asked gently. Clara considered the question seriously, then reached for her pencil. But instead of writing, she took a deep breath and whispered, "Different. Like I remembered something I thought I'd lost." The words came out clearer than any she'd spoken since beginning treatment. Not loud, but steady and intentional. "What did you remember?" Jenny asked, still holding her guitar but not playing. Clara closed her eyes, trying to put into words something that felt more like a feeling than a thought. "I remembered that my voice was never just about speaking. It was about connection, about sharing what's inside me with other people." Dr. Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's a profound realization. Many people think of voice recovery as simply regaining the mechanical ability to make words. But you've just discovered that your voice is really about expression and connection." Over the following days, Clara's recovery took on a different character. Instead of focusing solely on producing clearer speech, the therapy sessions incorporated music, breathing, and emotional exploration. Clara learned to use her voice as an instrument of expression, rather than just a tool for conveying information. She discovered that she could sing more easily than she could speak. That melody seemed to bypass whatever psychological barriers still guarded her voice. Jenny taught her simple songs that gradually incorporated more words, starting with la-la-la vocalizations and progressing to actual lyrics. The harmonica became another valuable tool. Clara found that playing it strengthened her breath control and helped her understand how airflow affected sound production. More importantly, it gave her a way to participate in the saloon's evening atmosphere, even when her voice wasn't cooperating. One evening, as the usual crowd of cowboys gathered for dinner and drinks, Clara emerged from the kitchen carrying her harmonica. The sight of her with an instrument caused a stir of curiosity, but the patrons settled down expectantly when she raised it to her lips. What followed was a hauntingly beautiful rendition of Shenandoah, a song that most of the men knew from their own wandering days. Clara's playing was technically imperfect. She was still learning the instrument, but it was filled with such emotion that several of the hardened cowboys had tears in their eyes by the time she finished. The applause was gentle and respectful, the kind of appreciation reserved for something genuinely moving rather than merely entertaining. Jake Morrison raised his coffee cup in a silent toast, and several other men nodded their approval. "That was beautiful, Clara," called out Big Tom Murphy, speaking louder than necessary so she could hear him clearly. "Didn't know you were musical." Clara smiled and, to everyone's surprise, whispered back, "I'm still learning." Her voice was quiet, but in the expectant silence of the saloon, everyone heard her clearly. The fact that she'd chosen to respond verbally, rather than just nodding, created a ripple of excitement through the room. From that evening forward, Clara's harmonica became a regular part of the Dusty Boots atmosphere. She'd play during quiet moments, providing gentle background music that seemed to calm even the rowdiest customers. The music gave her a way to participate in the saloon's social life without the pressure of conversation. While gradually building her confidence in using her voice. Dr. Morrison was fascinated by Clara's progress with the instruments. "You've discovered something that many trained singers take years to learn," she observed during a therapy session. "Music and voice are intimately connected. By strengthening one, you strengthen the other." But the real test came during Clara's second week of treatment, when a crisis at the saloon forced her to make a choice between safety and connection. It started with a fight between two young cowboys who'd been drinking heavily and arguing over a card game. Samuel was in town getting supplies, and Rosie May was visiting her sister in the next county, leaving Clara alone to handle the evening crowd. The argument escalated quickly, with both men getting to their feet and squaring off in the middle of the saloon. The other patrons backed away, forming a circle around the potential combatants, but not intervening. This was the kind of situation that could quickly turn dangerous, especially with alcohol involved. Clara watched from behind the bar, her heart racing as she tried to decide what to do. In the past, she would have retreated to the kitchen and waited for the situation to resolve itself, trusting that the other customers would handle any real trouble. But now, with her voice beginning to return, she felt a responsibility to try to help. The two cowboys were Jake Henderson and Billy Foster, both young men in their early 20s who worked for competing ranches. Their argument had started over cards but had quickly devolved into personal insults and challenges to each other's courage and competence. "You calling me a cheat?" Jake demanded, his hands clenched into fists. "If the boot fits," Billy replied, pushing Jake's shoulder. The push was the signal everyone had been dreading. Both men dropped into fighting stances, and the circle of spectators grew tighter, anticipating violence. Clara made her decision. She stepped out from behind the bar, walked to the piano that sat unused in the corner of the saloon, and sat down at the bench. Her fingers found the keys, dusty and slightly out of tune, but functional, and she began to play. The song was "Danny Boy," a melody that every man in the room knew and associated with home, family, and loss. Clara's playing was simple, but heartfelt, and gradually the tension in the room began to shift. Jake and Billy were still facing each other, fists raised, but they were no longer focused solely on their anger. The music was pulling their attention away from the fight and towards something deeper and more universal. As Clara played, she began to hum along with the melody. Her voice was still quiet, but in the acoustics of the wooden building, it carried clearly to every corner of the room. The humming added a layer of humanity to the instrumental music, reminding everyone present that behind the simple melody was a person who had chosen to offer beauty instead of watching violence unfold. Gradually, Clara's humming evolved into actual words, sung so softly that people had to strain to hear them. "Oh, Danny Boy. The pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside." Her voice was rough and uncertain, nothing like a trained singer's polished tones, but it carried something more valuable than technical perfection. It carried courage, the courage of someone who had chosen to be vulnerable in order to help others. The effect on the room was electric. Jake Henderson slowly lowered his fists, his anger replaced by amazement at hearing Clara sing. Billy Foster took a step backward, his aggressive stance melting into stunned attention. The other patrons moved closer to the piano, drawn by the rare and precious sound of Clara's voice raised in song. As Clara continued singing, her voice grew slightly stronger, though it never rose above a level that required careful listening. She sang the entire first verse of Danny Boy, her fingers moving confidently across the piano keys despite years of not playing. When the song ended, the saloon was completely silent. Clara sat at the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys, hardly believing what she'd just done. She'd sung, really sung, with words and melody and expression, in front of a room full of people. Jake Henderson was the first to move. He walked slowly to the piano, his earlier anger completely forgotten, and placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Thank you for stopping us from doing something stupid." Billy Foster approached from the other side, his face red with embarrassment. "I'm sorry you had to see us acting like fools," he said. "Your singing reminded me of my mother back in Missouri. She used to play piano at our church." Clara looked up at both young men and whispered, "Fighting doesn't solve anything. It just creates more pain." The words were quiet but clear, and they carried the weight of personal experience. Everyone in the room understood that Clara was speaking from knowledge of real loss, real pain that made the Cowboys' argument seem petty and meaningless. Jake and Billy looked at each other, then simultaneously extended their hands for a handshake. "No hard feelings," Jake said. "None at all," Billy agreed. "Want to finish that card game peacefully?" As the two men returned to their table, the rest of the saloon slowly returned to normal conversation and activity. But the atmosphere had changed. Clara's intervention had reminded everyone that they were part of a community, that their actions affected others, and that beauty and music and human connection were more powerful than anger and violence. Clara remained at the piano for the rest of the evening, playing simple melodies and occasionally singing along when the mood struck her. Her voice grew more confident as the night progressed, though it never became loud or assertive. Instead, it remained intimate and personal, drawing people closer rather than commanding attention from a distance. When Samuel returned from town and heard about what had happened, he was both proud and concerned. "You took a big risk," he told Clara as they cleaned up after closing. "What if those boys hadn't listened to the music?" Clara considered his question seriously, then whispered, "Then at least I would have tried. I've spent 7 years being silent when I could have been helping. I don't want to waste any more time being afraid." Dr. Morrison was amazed when she heard about Clara's public singing. "You've made more progress in one evening than some patients make in months," she observed. "But more importantly, you've discovered that your voice can be a force for healing. Not just for yourself, but for others." The incident at the saloon marked a turning point in Clara's recovery. She began to understand that regaining her voice wasn't just about personal healing. It was about reclaiming her ability to participate fully in her community, to offer comfort and beauty and wisdom when they were needed. Over the following days, Clara's therapy sessions took on new urgency and focus. She worked diligently on expanding her vocal range, improving her breath control, and building the stamina to speak for longer periods. But the technical aspects of voice recovery were now secondary to the emotional and social aspects of learning to use her voice as a tool for connection and service. Jenny was particularly impressed by Clara's musical abilities. "You have natural talent," she observed during a session where Clara was learning to play guitar. "Have you ever considered that music might be your primary form of expression, with regular speech being secondary?" Clara thought about this suggestion seriously. She'd always assumed that the goal of therapy was to return her voice to what it had been before the fire, a tool for everyday conversation and communication. But perhaps her voice was meant for something different now, something that incorporated the wisdom and empathy she'd gained during her years of silence. "Maybe," Clara whispered in response to Jenny's question, Maybe my voice is supposed to be different now. Maybe it's supposed to carry things it couldn't carry when I was 12. Dr. Morrison nodded approvingly. That's a very mature insight. Many people think that healing means returning to exactly what they were before trauma occurred. But sometimes, healing means becoming something new, something that incorporates both the pain and the growth that came from surviving difficult experiences. As Clara's second week of treatment drew to a close, she faced a new challenge. Dr. Morrison and Jenny would be leaving Copper Ridge to return to their other patients and responsibilities. Clara would need to continue her recovery largely on her own, with only occasional visits from the medical team. "I'm not ready," Clara whispered when Dr. Morrison explained the situation. "What if my voice disappears again when you're not here to help?" "It won't," Dr. Morrison assured her with confidence that Clara didn't feel. "You've internalized the techniques. You understand how your voice works now. And you've discovered that it's not just about making sounds, it's about making connections. That knowledge doesn't disappear when I leave." Jenny packed up her instruments with obvious reluctance. Working with Clara had been one of her most rewarding experiences as a music therapist, and she was genuinely sad to see the partnership end. "I'm leaving the kalimba with you," Jenny said, placing the small instrument in Clara's hands. "And I want you to promise me something. Promise that you'll keep making music, even if your speaking voice has difficult days. Music will always be there for you, even when words aren't." Clara held the kalimba close to her chest and nodded. "I promise." On their final evening in Copper Ridge, Dr. Morrison and Jenny attended the Saloon's dinner service as regular customers, rather than medical professionals. They watched with pride as Clara moved through her routine, now occasionally speaking to customers, humming while she worked, and even singing softly along with the piano music that Jake Morrison had started playing in the evenings. "Look at her," Jenny whispered to Dr. Morrison as Clara approached their table with their meals. "She's not the same person who couldn't make a sound 2 weeks ago." Clara set down their plates and surprised them both by speaking clearly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Thank you for giving me back my voice. But more than that, thank you for teaching me that I never really lost it, I just forgot how to use it." Dr. Morrison's eyes filled with tears. "Clara, you did all the hard work. We just provided some guidance and encouragement. And good music," Clara added with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Don't forget the good music." As the evening wound down and the last customers headed home to their ranches and boarding houses, Clara sat at the piano and played one final song for her departing teachers. She chose "Amazing Grace," the same hymn she'd sung during her first major breakthrough, but this time her voice was stronger, clearer, and filled with gratitude rather than tentative hope. When she finished, the three women sat in comfortable silence, understanding that they had shared something rare and precious, the gift of witnessing a human soul reclaim something essential that had been lost to trauma and fear. Clara's journey was far from over, but she was no longer traveling it alone or in silence. She had her voice back, not as it had been before, but as something new and more powerful, a voice tempered by loss, strengthened by courage, and dedicated to healing both herself and others through the power of music and human connection. First week after Dr. Morrison and Jenny's departure felt like learning to walk on a tightrope without a safety net. Clara woke each morning with a flutter of anxiety in her chest, testing her voice with gentle humming before her feet touched the floor. Some mornings the sound came easily, flowing from her throat like water from a spring. Other mornings she had to coax it out syllable by syllable, each word a small victory against the lingering fear that her silence might return without warning. But something fundamental had shifted during those 2 weeks of intensive therapy. Clara no longer saw her voice as something fragile that might break at any moment. Instead, she understood it as something that required daily care and attention, like tending a garden or maintaining a piece of delicate machinery. She developed Her own routine of vocal exercises, breathing techniques, and musical practice that kept her voice strong and flexible. The kalimba became her constant companion, living in her apron pocket during work hours and beside her bed at night. When words felt difficult, she could always find expression through its gentle tones. When her throat felt tight with stress or emotion, playing its soothing melodies helped her relax the physical tension that could silence her as effectively as any trauma. The transformation in Clara's daily life was remarkable to witness. Samuel, who had grown accustomed to communicating with her through nods and written notes, now found himself in actual conversations with the young woman he'd watched grow up in silence. Their morning coffee routine, once conducted in comfortable quiet, now included discussions about the weather, plans for the day, and Clara's observations about their regular customers. Mrs. Henderson looked tired when she came in for supplies. "Yesterday," Clara mentioned one morning, her voice still soft but clearly audible across the kitchen table. "I think she's worried about her husband's cough. Maybe we should send over some of Rosie May's honey tea recipe." Samuel paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips, still amazed by Clara's transformation from silent observer to active participant in their small community's welfare. "That's a thoughtful idea. You've always noticed things about people that the rest of us miss." "I had 7 years to practice watching and listening," Clara replied with a slight smile. "I suppose that's one good thing that came from being quiet. For so long, I learned to pay attention." The changes in Clara's relationship with the saloon's customers were even more dramatic. Cowboys who had known her only as the efficient, silent-serving girl discovered that she had opinions, insights, and a gentle sense of humor that emerged when she felt comfortable enough to share it. Jake Morrison, who had appointed himself Clara's unofficial protector during her silent years, was delighted to find that he could now have actual conversations with her. Their evening chats over his coffee had evolved from his one-sided monologues to genuine exchanges of ideas and observations. "You know," Jake said one evening as Clara refilled his cup, "I always wondered what you thought about all the stories we cowboys tell in here. Some of them are pretty tall tales." Clara smiled and whispered conspiratorially, "I always knew which ones were true and which ones weren't. The true stories have different details. They include things like being scared or making mistakes. The tall tales only include the heroic parts." Jake laughed, a rich sound that filled the corner of the saloon. "You're absolutely right. I'll have to remember that when I'm spinning my own yarns." But it was Clara's relationship with Rosie May that underwent the most profound transformation. The older woman had been Clara's closest confidant during the silent years, communicating through shared work, meaningful glances, and an intuitive understanding that transcended words. Now they could finally give voice to the friendship that had sustained them both. "Child," Rosie May said one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen, "I have to tell you something I've been holding in for years. When you first came to work here, so small and scared and quiet, I saw myself at that age. I lost my own voice for a while after some bad things happened when I was young." Clara stopped stirring the pot of stew she was tending and turned to look at Rosie May with surprise. "You did? But you've always been so strong, so sure of yourself." "Strength doesn't mean you never get broken," Rosie May replied, her voice gentle but firm. "It means you learn how to put yourself back together, maybe in new ways that make you even stronger than before. That's what you've done, Clara. You've put yourself back together. And the woman you are now is more beautiful than the girl you were before." These words meant more to Clara than any medical assessment or therapeutic breakthrough. To hear from someone she loved and respected that her healing hadn't just restored what was lost, but had created something new and valuable, that validation gave her the confidence to continue pushing the boundaries of her recovery. The push came in the form of an unexpected challenge. Word of Clara's recovery had spread beyond Copper Ridge. carried by the cowboys who traveled between towns and ranches across the territory. People began arriving at the Dusty Boot, not just for food and drink, but hoping to hear the girl who had found her voice after 7 years of silence. At first, Clara found the attention overwhelming. She wasn't ready to be anyone's inspiration or curiosity, and the pressure of expectation made her throat tighten with familiar anxiety. But Samuel, protective as always, helped her navigate the increased interest in a way that felt manageable. "You don't owe anyone a performance," he told Clara firmly when a group of travelers from Phoenix arrived, specifically requesting that she sing for them. "Your voice belongs to you, and you get to decide when and how to share it." Clara appreciated Samuel's protection, but she also realized that hiding from attention wasn't sustainable. If people were going to seek her out anyway, perhaps she could find a way to use that interest for something positive. The idea came to her during the conversation with a young woman named Sarah Collins, who had traveled from Tucson with her family, specifically to meet Clara. Sarah's 8-year-old daughter, Emily, had stopped speaking after witnessing a stagecoach robbery that had left her father injured and traumatized. "The doctors say there's nothing physically wrong with Emily," Sarah explained, her voice thick with worry and exhaustion. "But she hasn't said a word in 6 months. We heard about your recovery, and we hoped maybe seeing you, hearing you speak, might help her understand that voices can come back." Clara looked at Emily, a small girl with dark hair and enormous eyes that reminded her painfully of her own appearance at 12 years old. The child sat perfectly still beside her mother, observing everything but participating in nothing. A posture Clara recognized intimately. "Dr. Morrison taught me something important," Clara said, speaking directly to Emily, even though the girl showed no sign of acknowledgement. "She taught me that our voices never really go away. They just hide, sometimes waiting for us to feel safe enough to let them out again." Clara reached into her apron pocket and withdrew the kalimba. "Would you like to hear this?" she asked Emily. "It makes music without needing words." For the first time since entering the saloon, Emily showed interest. She nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on the small instrument. Clara played a simple melody, one that Jenny had taught her during their sessions. As the gentle notes filled the space around their table, she watched Emily's posture begin to relax slightly. "Music is a kind of voice too," Clara continued, still playing. "Sometimes it says things that words can't say. Would you like to try touching it?" Emily looked at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. The little girl reached out one tentative finger and touched one of the kalimba's metal tines, producing a clear, sweet note. "That's your music," Clara said softly. "It came from you, even without words." Emily touched another tine, then another, creating a random but somehow musical sequence of notes. For the first time since the robbery, her face showed something other than withdrawal, curiosity, even enjoyment. Clara didn't push for more. She simply played along with Emily's random notes, creating harmonies that made the child's tentative exploration sound like intentional music. They played together for nearly 10 minutes, two people communicating through sound without needing words. When Emily and her family prepared to leave, the little girl approached Clara and whispered, so quietly that only Clara could hear, "Thank you for the music." Sarah Collins gasped and began crying, the first words her daughter had spoken in 6 months. Emily looked surprised at her own voice, but not frightened. Clara had shown her that making sound could be gentle and safe. "Keep practicing with music," Clara advised Sarah. "Don't push for words, but let her explore sound. Sometimes the voice comes back through song before it comes back through speech." Word of Clara's interaction with Emily spread quickly, and soon the Dusty Boot was receiving visits from families dealing with trauma-related mutism in children and adults. Clara found herself in an unexpected role, not as a medical professional, but as living proof that recovery was possible, and as someone who understood the landscape of silence from personal experience. Samuel was initially concerned about the additional responsibility this placed on Clara, but she embraced it with enthusiasm that surprised them both. "I spent 7 years learning things about silence that I never wanted to know," Clara explained to Samuel as they discussed the growing stream of visitors. "If that knowledge can help other people, then maybe those years weren't entirely lost." Time. Clara developed her own informal approach to helping other trauma survivors. She never claimed to be a therapist or medical professional, but she offered something equally valuable: understanding, hope, and practical strategies for coping with the challenges of vocal recovery. She taught breathing exercises she'd learned from Dr. Morrison. She shared musical techniques Jenny had shown her. Most importantly, she provided living evidence that traumatic mutism wasn't a permanent condition, that voices could return even after years of absence. The work was emotionally demanding. Each person who came to see Clara carried their own story of loss and trauma, and hearing these stories inevitably brought back memories of her own darkest moments. But Clara discovered that helping others actually strengthened her own recovery rather than threatening it. "Sharing my voice makes it stronger," she explained to Rosie May after a particularly intense session with a Civil War veteran who hadn't spoken since witnessing a devastating battle. "It's like the more I use it to help other people, the more solid and reliable it becomes for me." The veteran, Marcus Webb, had been brought to see Clara by his concerned wife after 2 years of complete silence. Unlike Clara's childhood trauma, Marcus's mutism stemmed from witnessing such overwhelming violence that his mind had simply refused to process or articulate the experience. Clara worked with Marcus differently than she did with children. Instead of music, she started with simple presence, sitting quietly with him while he struggled with memories too terrible for words. She understood that sometimes healing required sharing silence before sharing sound. "I know you think your voice is gone forever," Clara said during their third session, her own voice calm and steady. "I thought the same thing, but I learned that our voices don't disappear because of what we've seen or experienced. They hide because they're trying to protect us from having to put impossible things into words." Marcus looked at her with eyes that held depths of pain Clara recognized. She continued, "You don't have to tell anyone what you saw or what you've been through. Your voice can come back just to say simple things. Good morning, thank you, I love you. It doesn't have to carry the weight of everything you've witnessed." The breakthrough came during Marcus's 4th visit, when Clara was playing her kalimba and humming along. Marcus began to make a low sound in his throat, not words or even melody, but vocalization, the first intentional sound he'd made in 2 years. His wife wept when she heard it. Clara simply nodded and continued playing, allowing Marcus to explore his rediscovered ability to make sound without pressure, to turn it into anything more complex. Over the following weeks, Marcus progressed from vocalizations to humming to simple words. Like Clara, he found that his voice returned gradually and imperfectly, but it did return. His recovery gave Clara deep satisfaction and reinforced her growing understanding that her own healing was intimately connected to helping others find their way back to speech. The success stories accumulated. There was 12-year-old Timothy, who had stopped speaking after his parents' death and found his voice again through singing cowboy ballads. There was Maria Santos, a young woman whose mutism resulted from an assault, who began speaking again. After learning to play the harmonica Clara had gifted her, each recovery was different, reflecting the unique circumstances and personality of the individual. But they all shared common elements: the gradual building of trust, the use of music as a bridge between silence and speech, and the powerful impact of hope demonstrated through Clara's own transformation. Clara's reputation as someone who could help trauma survivors spread throughout the Arizona territory and beyond. The Dusty Boot began receiving letters from people asking for advice, and occasionally individuals would travel hundreds of miles to spend time with Clara and learn her techniques. Samuel had to expand the saloon's capacity to accommodate the increased visitors, but he did so gladly. The establishment had become something unique, not just a place for cowboys to eat and drink, but a center of healing and hope for people struggling with trauma-related silence. "You've turned this place into something special," Samuel told Clara. One evening as they surveyed the crowded main room, filled with a mixture of regular customers and people seeking Clara's help, "I never imagined when I hired a scared 12-year-old girl that she'd grow up to be someone who could change people's lives." Clara looked around the room she'd called home for 7 years, now transformed by her own transformation. At one table, Marcus Webb was having a quiet conversation with his wife, using the voice he'd reclaimed through their work together. At another, Emily Collins was visiting with her family, chattering excitedly about the song she'd been learning to sing. "I think this is what my voice was meant for," Clara said, her words carrying clearly across the noise of the busy saloon. "Not just for my own use, but for helping other voices find their way home." As she spoke, Clara realized that her voice had grown stronger and clearer than she'd ever dared hope during those first tentative days of therapy. It wasn't the same voice she'd had as a child. It was deeper, richer, carrying the weight of experience and the authority of someone who had traveled through darkness and emerged into light. The girl who had lost her voice in the flames that took her family was gone forever. But the woman who had found a new voice in the ashes of that loss was someone far more powerful than she could have imagined. Clara Bennett had become not just someone who could speak again, but someone whose speaking could heal the broken places in other people's souls. Standing in the transformed saloon, surrounded by the voices of people she'd helped find their way back to speech, Clara understood that her 7 years of silence hadn't been wasted time. They had been preparation for this moment, this purpose, this calling to use her own recovered voice to call other voices home. The journey was far from over, but Clara no longer traveled it alone or in silence. She had found her place in the world, not as the quiet girl who served food and observed life from the margins, but as a woman whose voice could bridge the gap between despair and hope, between silence and song, between the broken places in human hearts and the healing power of human connection. 5 years had passed since that first tentative hum had escaped Clara's lips in Dr. Morrison's makeshift therapy room, and the Dusty Boot Saloon had become something nobody in Copper Ridge could have imagined. What had once been a simple way station for cowboys and travelers was now known across 3 territories as the place where broken voices came to heal. The physical changes to the establishment were obvious to anyone who visited. Samuel had added a wing to the building that housed what Clara called the quiet rooms, spaces designed specifically for working with trauma survivors who needed privacy and calm environments to begin their recovery. The main saloon still served its original purpose, but it now also functioned as a community gathering place where people celebrated the return of voices that had been lost to violence, accident, or overwhelming grief. But the most remarkable transformation was in Clara herself. At 26, she had grown from the frightened, silent girl who had arrived in Copper Ridge into a woman whose presence commanded respect and whose voice carried healing power that drew people from as far away as San Francisco and New Orleans. Her voice had evolved too, developing qualities that went beyond simple speech recovery. There was a musical quality to her speaking now, a rhythm and resonance that came from years of combining vocal therapy with constant singing and instrumental practice. When Clara spoke to groups of trauma survivors, her voice had the power to calm anxiety, inspire hope, and create the kind of safety that allowed people to risk being vulnerable. The morning that would change everything started like many others over the past few years. Clara woke before dawn, spent an hour doing the breathing and vocal exercises that had become as natural as brushing her teeth, then made her way to the kitchen where Rosie May was already preparing breakfast for the early customers and the house guests who had come seeking Clara's help. "Morning, child," Rosie May said, looking up from the biscuit dough she was kneading. "We've got a full house today. That family from Colorado checked in last night. And there's word that Dr. Morrison herself is coming to visit. Clara smiled as she tied her apron around her waist. Dr. Morrison's periodic visits had become treasured events, opportunities to share successes and discuss difficult cases with someone who understood the complexities of trauma recovery. She mentioned in her last letter that she's bringing a colleague from back east, someone who's interested in documenting what we've accomplished here. What Clara didn't know was that Dr. Morrison's colleague was Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, one of the most respected neurologists in the country, and that their visit was part of a larger plan that would soon offer Clara opportunities she'd never dreamed possible. The morning's first breakthrough came with 16-year-old Catherine Moore, a girl from Denver whose selective mutism had developed after witnessing her younger brother's accidental death. Catherine had been working with Clara for 3 weeks, making slow but steady progress with breathing exercises and musical expression, but hadn't yet attempted to speak. Clara was in one of the quiet rooms with Catherine, working through a series of gentle vocalizations when something shifted. Catherine had been humming along with Clara's kalimba, playing when she suddenly stopped and looked directly into Clara's eyes. "I want to tell my parents I love them," Catherine whispered. The words barely audible but perfectly clear. Clara felt the familiar thrill that came with witnessing someone reclaim their voice, but this time it was enhanced by the knowledge that Catherine's breakthrough would ripple out to her entire family. The girl's parents had been carrying crushing guilt about their son's death and their daughter's subsequent silence, and Catherine's first words would begin healing wounds that had festered for months. "Then let's practice saying that," Clara replied gently. "The most important words should be the easiest ones to say." They spent the next hour working on those 5 words. "I want to tell my parents I love them," until Catherine could say them clearly and with conviction. When they emerged from the quiet room, Catherine walked directly to where her parents were sitting in the main saloon, took a deep breath, and spoke her first words in 8 months. "Mama, Papa, I love you so much." The emotional scene that followed, tears, embraces, and Catherine's halting but determined explanation that her silence hadn't been their fault, was witnessed by everyone in the saloon. It was exactly the kind of moment that had made the Dusty Boot famous, but it was also the moment that caught Dr. Whitmore's attention as he and Dr. Morrison arrived to witness Catherine's family reunion. Dr. Whitmore was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s whose reputation was built on groundbreaking research into brain trauma and recovery. He had come to Copper Ridge skeptical of reports about Clara's success rate with trauma survivors, expecting to find well-meaning but unscientific methods being applied to a few isolated cases. Instead, he found himself observing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about neurological recovery. "Miss Bennett," Dr. Whitmore said after Dr. Morrison had introduced them, "I've read Dr. Morrison's reports about your work, but I confess I'm struggling to understand how someone without formal medical training has achieved success rates that surpass those of university-trained specialists." Clara studied the older man's face, recognizing the mixture of curiosity and skepticism that she'd seen in other medical professionals who visited the saloon. She'd learned to address such doubts directly and honestly. "I think it's because I understand something that medical training might not teach," Clara replied, her voice calm and confident. "I understand what it feels like to live without a voice, and I understand what it takes to trust that voice enough to let it come back. That understanding isn't something you can learn from books." Dr. Whitmore frowned slightly. "But surely the technical aspects of vocal recovery require medical knowledge. Breathing techniques, muscle coordination, neurological pathways." "Of course they do," Clara agreed. "Dr. Morrison taught me those things, and I use them every day. But the technical knowledge only works if the person feels safe enough to risk being hurt again. That's the part that requires something beyond medical expertise." To demonstrate her point, Clara asked Dr. Whitmore to observe her session with Robert Chun, a 40-year-old merchant from San Francisco, who had lost his voice after being attacked and robbed on the journey to Copper Ridge. Robert had been working with Clara for 2 weeks without making significant progress, despite having no physical damage to his vocal cords. "Robert struggles with trust," Clara explained quietly as they watched the man sit rigidly in his chair, his jaw clenched with tension. "He was attacked while traveling alone, and his voice disappeared because speaking feels dangerous now. It makes him visible, vulnerable." Clara began the session not with vocal exercises, but with music. She played her kalimba softly, creating a peaceful atmosphere that gradually helped Robert's shoulders relax. As the music continued, she began to speak to him in tones so gentle they were almost whispers. "You're safe here, Robert. No one in this room will hurt you. Your voice belongs to you, and you can choose when and how to use it." Over the course of an hour, Clara gradually guided Robert through exercises that rebuilt his confidence in making sound. She started with breathing, moved to gentle humming, then to simple vocalizations. Throughout the process, she provided constant reassurance and created multiple opportunities for Robert to succeed at small challenges. The breakthrough came when Clara asked Robert to hum along with a melody that reminded him of his childhood in China. As the familiar tune brought back memories of safety and family, Robert's voice emerged naturally, without force or struggle. "That's beautiful," Clara said when Robert finished humming. "Your voice carries your history, your culture, your connection to people you love. That's something worth protecting, not something to fear." By the end of the session, Robert was speaking in whispers, then in normal tones, expressing gratitude and amazement at his recovered ability to communicate verbally. Dr. Whitmore had observed the entire session with growing fascination. "That was remarkable," he admitted to Clara afterward. "You addressed the psychological barriers to speech recovery in ways that I've never seen attempted. Where did you learn those techniques?" "I learned them by being silent for 7 years," Clara replied. "I learned what it feels like when people try to force you to speak before you're ready. And I learned what it feels like when someone creates space for your voice to return naturally. Everything I do with my patients comes from that understanding." Dr. Morrison had been watching the interaction between Clara and her colleague with satisfaction. She'd brought Dr. Whitmore to Copper Ridge precisely to witness Clara's unique approach to trauma recovery, and she could see that he was beginning to understand what made Clara's work so effective. "Jonathan," Dr. Morrison said, "I want to discuss something with both of you. There's an opportunity that could expand Clara's reach far beyond what she can accomplish here in Copper Ridge." Over dinner that evening, Dr. Morrison outlined a proposal that took Clara's breath away. The Eastern Medical Institute, one of the most prestigious research hospitals in the country, was establishing a new department focused on trauma-related speech disorders. They were looking for someone to head the department who combined medical knowledge with practical experience in vocal recovery. "They want you, Clara," Dr. Morrison said directly. "They want you to move to Philadelphia, complete formal medical training, and then establish a program based on the methods you've developed here." Clara sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered. A chance to receive formal medical education, to work with resources and equipment she could only dream of in Copper Ridge, to help trauma survivors on a scale that would multiply her current impact hundreds of times over. But the opportunity also meant leaving everything she'd built in Copper Ridge, the saloon that had become her home, the community that had supported her recovery, the work she'd established with local trauma survivors who depended on her presence. "I need time to think about this," Clara said finally. "This place, these people, they're not just where I work. They're part of who I am." Dr. Whitmore leaned forward. "Miss Bennett, what you've accomplished here is extraordinary, but imagine what you could accomplish with proper resources and a team of trained professionals. You could help thousands of people instead of dozens." That night, Clara walked through the saloon after closing, running her fingers along the familiar wooden tables where she'd served countless meals during her silent years, touching the piano where she'd sung her first public song, Standing in the quiet rooms where she'd witnessed so many voices return from exile. Samuel found her there near midnight, sitting at the table where she'd first met Dr. Morrison and Jenny Walsh 5 years ago. Tough decision? He asked, settling into the chair across from her. The hardest I've ever had to make, Clara admitted. Part of me is terrified to leave all this. But another part of me wonders if staying here is the safe choice, and whether I'm being called to do something bigger and scarier. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. You know, when you first came to work here, you were making the safe choice too. Staying quiet, staying invisible, staying protected. But eventually, you had to risk that safety to find your voice again. Clara looked at the man who had been like a father to her for 14 years. Are you saying I should go? I'm saying you should trust the same instincts that helped you find your voice in the first place, Samuel replied. What does that voice tell you to do? Clara closed her eyes and listened to the quiet voice inside her that had guided her through recovery and into her healing work. When she opened them again, her decision was clear. It tells me that I can't help everyone who needs help by staying in one place, no matter how much I love that place, she said. It tells me that I've learned everything I can learn here, and it's time to take what I've learned into the bigger world. The announcement of Clara's decision to accept the position in Philadelphia created waves of reaction throughout the community. Some people were thrilled for her opportunity to expand her impact. Others were devastated at the thought of losing someone who had become central to the healing and hope available in their region. But Clara's approach to the transition reflected the wisdom she'd gained through her own recovery and her work with others. Instead of simply leaving, she spent 6 months preparing the community for her departure by training local volunteers in basic vocal recovery techniques and establishing a network of support that could continue helping trauma survivors even without her direct involvement. She worked with Dr. Morrison to create a training program that would allow selected community members to provide initial support to trauma survivors while connecting them with professional resources when needed. Jake Morrison, whose evening conversations with Clara had given him deep insight into her methods, became one of the first trained volunteers. I can't replace what you do, Jake told Clara during one of their training sessions, but I can listen. The way you taught me to listen, and I can help people feel safe while they're finding their voices again. Rosie May, despite her lack of formal education, proved to have natural instincts for creating the kind of nurturing environment that supported vocal recovery. Honey, she told Clara, I've been feeding people's bodies for 40 years. Feeding their spirits while they heal isn't so different. The most emotional farewell came from the trauma survivors who had found their voices through Clara's guidance. Many of them traveled back to Copper Ridge, specifically to wish her well and to demonstrate how their recovered voices had transformed their lives. Catherine Moore, now speaking fluently and preparing to return to school, spoke for many of them. You didn't just give us back our voices. You showed us that voices can be stronger after they've been broken and healed than they ever were before they were damaged. On Clara's final evening in Copper Ridge, the entire community gathered at the Dusty Boot for a celebration that was part farewell party and part testimonial service. One by one, people stood to share stories of how Clara's voice had touched their lives, not just the trauma survivors she'd helped directly, but family members who had watched their loved ones heal, community members who had witnessed transformation they'd thought impossible, and visitors who had carried news of hope back to their own communities. The evening culminated with Clara standing at the piano, where she'd sung her first public song 7 years earlier. But instead of performing alone, she was joined by a chorus of voices, all the people she'd helped find their way back to speech, singing together in harmony that filled the saloon and spilled out into the desert night. They sang Amazing Grace, the same hymn that had marked Clara's first breakthrough, but now it carried new meaning. It wasn't just about one person's recovery from trauma and silence. It was about the power of healed voices to heal other voices, about the way courage and hope could spread from person to person, creating communities of recovery that were stronger than any individual healing. As the last notes faded into the night air, Clara looked out at the faces surrounding her, faces that had been changed by witnessing recovery they'd thought impossible, voices that had been encouraged to speak truth and hope because they'd seen that silence didn't have to be permanent. 5 years ago, Clara said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the packed saloon, I thought my story was about losing something precious and learning to live without it. But I've learned that my story is really about discovering that what seems lost can be found again, and that what is found can be shared, and that sharing it makes it stronger. She paused, looking directly at the trauma survivors who had become her closest collaborators in the work of healing. Your voices matter. Not just because you deserve to be heard, but because the world needs what you have to say. You've survived things that broke your voices, but you've also learned things about courage and hope that people who've never been broken might never understand. Clara's departure from Copper Ridge the next morning was witnessed by the entire town. As the stagecoach pulled away, carrying her toward a future she could barely imagine, the sound that followed her wasn't tears or grief, but singing. Dozens of voices raised together in melodies she had taught them, carrying her forward with music instead of holding her back with sorrow. The journey to Philadelphia took 2 weeks, during which Clara documented her methods and philosophy in detail, journals that would eventually become the foundation for a new approach to trauma recovery. But more than writing about technique, she reflected on the deeper truths her experience had taught her. Voice, she realized, was never just about the mechanical ability to produce sound. It was about the courage to be known, the willingness to risk being misunderstood, the faith that connection was possible even after trust had been shattered. Her work in Copper Ridge had been successful not because she'd mastered vocal techniques, but because she'd learned to create spaces where people felt safe, enough to risk being hurt again. When Clara arrived at the Eastern Medical Institute, she was greeted by Dr. Whitmore and a team of researchers who were eager to learn from her unconventional but remarkably effective methods. The contrast between the sophisticated medical facility and the simple saloon where she developed her approach was stark, but Clara understood that the principles remained the same. Healing happens in relationship, she told the assembled medical team during her first presentation. All the technical knowledge in the world won't help someone recover their voice if they don't trust that it's safe to be heard. Over the following months, Clara threw herself into formal medical education with the same intensity she'd once applied to learning silence and then to recovering speech. But she never lost sight of the human element that had made her work in Copper Ridge so effective. The program she eventually established at the Institute became a model for trauma recovery centers across the country. It combined rigorous medical science with the kind of emotional safety and musical therapy that had characterized her work at the Dusty Boot. Most importantly, it trained medical professionals to understand that technical expertise had to be paired with genuine empathy and respect for each patient's unique journey toward healing. Years later, when Clara was recognized as one of the leading experts in trauma-related speech recovery, journalists would ask her about the secret to her success. Her answer was always the same: I learned to listen to silence until I understood what it was trying to protect. Then I learned to create safety so people could choose sound over silence. Everything else is just technique. But perhaps the most important part of Clara's legacy wasn't the medical center she established, or the hundreds of trauma survivors she helped directly. It was the network of healing that spread outward from her work, former patients who became advocates for other trauma survivors, communities that learned to recognize and respond to trauma-related silence, and a growing understanding that recovery was possible even when it seemed hopeless. The Dusty Boot Saloon continued to serve travelers and cowboys, but it also continued to serve as a place of healing under the guidance of the volunteers Clara had trained. A plaque beside the piano read simply, In this place, Clara Bennett found her voice and taught others to find theirs. May all who enter here be reminded that silence need not be permanent, and that every voice matters. And in Philadelphia, in an office overlooking one of the country's most advanced medical facilities, Clara kept a small kalimba on her desk, a reminder of the gentle instrument that had helped her bridge the gap between silence and song, between isolation and connection, between the girl who had lost everything to fire and the woman who had learned to transform loss into healing for others. The voice that had once been lost to trauma had become a voice that called other lost voices home. And in that calling, in that sharing, in that transformation of pain into purpose, Clara Bennett had found not just her own healing, but a way to heal the broken places in a world that desperately needed to believe that recovery was possible. That voices mattered, and that even the deepest silence could give way to song. 10 years after leaving Copper Ridge, Clara received a letter that would bring her story completely full circle. It came from Emily Collins, the 8-year-old girl who had been one of Clara's first success stories. Emily was now 18, preparing to enter medical school, and writing to thank Clara for showing her that trauma didn't have to define the rest of her life. "Dear Miss Bennett," the letter began, "you probably don't remember me, but I was the little girl who couldn't speak after my father was hurt in a stagecoach robbery. You gave me a kalimba to play, and you showed me that music could be a voice. When words weren't ready yet, I wanted you to know that I never stopped making music, and I never forgot the lesson you taught me about voices hiding until they felt safe to come out." Emily went on to explain that she had spent her teenage years volunteering with other children who had experienced trauma, using music therapy techniques she'd learned by watching Clara work. She credited Clara not just with helping her find her voice again, but with showing her that healing could become a calling. "I've decided to specialize in pediatric psychiatry," Emily continued, "because I want to help children the way you helped me. But more than that, I want to carry forward the understanding you gave me, that broken doesn't mean worthless, that silence can be temporary, and that sometimes the people who've been hurt the most are the ones who can offer the deepest healing to others." Clara read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face as she recognized the ripple effects of that long ago afternoon when she'd offered a kalimba to a frightened child. Emily's voice had not only returned, it had become strong enough to call other voices home, extending Clara's work into a new generation. Similar letters arrived regularly now, from people whose lives had been touched directly or indirectly by Clara's work. There was Marcus Webb, the Civil War veteran, who had become a counselor for other veterans struggling with trauma-related mutism. There was Jenny Walsh, Dr. Morrison's former assistant, who had established music therapy programs in 3 Western territories. There was even a letter from Thomas Wright, the journalist who had documented Clara's early recovery. REPORTING that his articles about her work had inspired the creation of trauma recovery centers in cities across the nation. Each letter reinforced Clara's understanding that healing was never just an individual journey. Every voice that found its way back to strength created possibilities for other voices to emerge from silence. Every person who chose courage over safety, connection over isolation, hope over despair, made it easier for the next person to make the same choice. Standing in her Philadelphia office, surrounded by medical texts and research papers, Clara could still hear the echoes of that first hum that had escaped her lips in a makeshift therapy room above a desert saloon. That single tentative sound had grown into a symphony of recovered voices, each one unique but all connected by the common experience of moving from silence to song, from isolation to community, from surviving trauma to transforming it into a source of strength for others. The girl who had once believed her voice was lost forever had become a woman whose voice would echo through generations of healers and survivors, proving that sometimes the most powerful voices belong to those who understand the true value of words because they remember what it was like to live without them. In learning to break her own silence, Clara Bennett had given countless others permission to break theirs, creating a legacy that would outlive any individual story. The eternal truth that every voice matters, every healing is possible, and every ending can become a new beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.